This is Warhawk Beyond 2040, and welcome to a very special edition of the Progressive Rock and Metal album review series. And today I am going to be taking a look at the amazing and impressive catalogue from art rock band Blackfield. So, Blackfield is a collaborative project that was formed in 2001 by Stephen Wilson and Aviv Geffen. And for those of you who know already, Stephen Wilson needs no introduction. He is best known as the founder of Porcupine Tree, and he has also led a number of different projects such as Base Communion, No Man, and Corrosion with Mikael Akerfeldt from Opeth. And he has also guested and played with a number of different bands and artists such as OSI, Opeth, and Steve Hackett, to name a few. And he also has a very long and successful career as a solo artist. And he is a world renowned producer who has produced and remixed for some of the most important bands in history. Bands such as ELP, King Crimson, and Yes, to name a few, and is considered by many to be the most important figure in music today, and is often referred to as the greatest musician you've never heard of. And Aviv Geffen is a Israeli rock musician slash singer-songwriter, and he has his own solo career as well as leading and fronting his own band called HaTauyot. And the seeds for the formation of Blackfield were planted when Porcupine Tree performed a couple of special shows in 2000 in Israel, and Aviv Geffen was invited as a special guest to sit in with the band. And Aviv Geffen has always professed how much of a big fan he has been of Porcupine Tree and has been a long admirer of the band and their music. And this led to Stephen Wilson and Aviv Geffen striking up a friendship, and this would lead to Aviv Geffen guesting on a Porcupine Tree album. And this eventually led to Stephen Wilson and Aviv Geffen joining forces to form Blackfield. So the music of Blackfield has a very commercial style with lots of influences of art rock and alternative, and it has lots of pop hooks and catchy harmonies. And unlike Porcupine Tree, who were always known for their more heavier and lengthier songs, Blackfield's music was a lot more lighter and a lot more softer and had more shorter songs, usually clocking in at around 3 to 4 minutes, or the occasional long song would be just over 5 to 6 minutes long. And the music of Blackfield, although it's very much rooted in rock, it's very catchy, and at times, as I said, it's got a very laid back approach. So this is not like Porcupine Tree at all. It's a lot more structured. So as I said, it's more like pop music, but the music at times can be very soft and light, and on other occasions it can occasionally get a bit more rockier and a bit more heavier. And I feel with Blackfield's music, this is the sort of music you would hear on the radio. It's got a very FM radio sort of flavor to their music. You know, there's lots of catchy songs, memorable harmonies, and much more shorter style of playing. So you're not looking for big, long, lengthy solos. Blackfield's music does exactly what it says on the tin, and there's some really good music. You know, I've just recently listened to their entire catalogue, and there's some very good, enjoyable stuff. The music can be very uplifting, it can be very soothing, and sometimes it does sound like Porcupine Tree, which is no surprise because you've got the main man, Stephen Wilson, co running the show. And, you know, imagine if Porcupine Tree went in a more commercial sort of direction. And they have done some commercial songs in the past, but imagine if they went the whole way in that realm. You probably would get something like Blackfield, or at least something close to that. And there's some really good stuff. There's some really good music, and Blackfield is a equal collaborative partnership between Stephen Wilson and Aviv Geffen, and they co-write most of the music. Although there are a couple of albums where Stephen Wilson wasn't actively involved in it due to concentrating on his exploding solo career, and Aviv Geffen would take on more of the lead for the music and running of Blackfield, with Stephen Wilson billed as a guest, where he would appear on a couple of tracks. And for today's special edition, I am going to be discussing Blackfield's entire catalogue of albums, which is a total of 6 studio recordings. And as always, I'm going to be talking about each album individually, and I'll be choosing which one I think is the best one. Not an easy challenge. I've enjoyed listening to all 6 Blackfield albums. They're all good. There are some that are a little bit better than others. There are a couple that I like probably a bit more than some of the rest, but there's still some great material, some great songs, and you know, I said before that this is kind of like a light Porcupine Tree, not as heavy, but still got some very memorable music, in my opinion. And you can't go wrong with this catalogue. They're all good. You can't really say, well, that album wasn't that great. It's Stephen Wilson, it's Aviv Geffen. You're going to get something really good. And as I said, this is the sort of music you could probably hear on the radio. So we're going to start with the first album, and this one came out in 2004, and this one is called Blackfield 1. So Blackfield 1 is the first album from the collaborative partnership of Stephen Wilson and Aviv Geffen, and it's a fantastic album. It's very lovely, very soothing, lots of catchy harmonies and great pop hooks. You name it, it's got it all. And this is a great debut album. A lot more softer and lighter than something you normally would expect from Stephen Wilson, but it's still very enjoyable. So the lineups for most of the Blackfield catalogue is kind of like a revolving lineup. So they wouldn't necessarily be the same group of guys you normally would hear on every single album. Obviously, you've got Stephen Wilson and Aviv Geffen at the helm, but there would also be other contributions from a number of guests. So we've got Stephen Wilson on guitars, vocals, and additional keyboards, and Aviv Geffen on guitars, additional keyboards, and vocals. And the lineup for Blackfield 1, we've got Daniel Soloman on piano and keyboards, Sefi Afrati on bass, and original former Porcupine Tree drummer Chris Maitland. And guest musicians, we've got Gavin Harrison from Porcupine Tree, Yomi Kaplan on drums, and we've got The Mistakes, who are featured on one track, and we've also got string arrangements on a few tracks performed by the Illusion String Quartet. So a lot of the string arrangements you hear on this album kind of give it a much more mellow and orchestrated feel, and it really pushes that more laid back approach of Blackfield. And as I said, the music from top to bottom is just excellent. And, Stephen Wilson, I feel in another lifetime, he could have been quite a big, successful mainstream pop star if he wasn't doing the progressive rock and progressive metal style of music. I think he could have gone on to be a very successful pop star if he kept this going. But Stephen Wilson is not one to stay in the same place. He likes to do a lot of different things. But here he's on top form, as is Aviv Geffen. So we've got the first track, Open Mind, which is just a lovely opener. And then we've got the title track, Blackfield, which is one of the best songs on this album. And then we've got Glow, which is great. Scars is an excellent song. Lullaby is another great song. Pain is a great song. Summer is brilliant. Cloudy Now is great. The Hole in Me, which is the shortest song on the entire album, which is like 2 minutes and 47 seconds, which is great. And then we've got the closer, Hello. But overall, top to bottom, this is a remarkably strong album with lots of commercial style of music. And as I said, this is not necessarily prog or hard rock. This is kind of more like pop rock, but still very enjoyable. So the standout tracks for me are Open Mind, Blackfield, Scars, Pain, Summer, The Hole in Me, and Hello. But awesome debut, and Aviv Geffen and Stephen Wilson both on top form, and they just work so well together, and their harmonies, their playing, it just works. It's such a perfect fit, and the way their harmonies blend together, it sounds like multiple singers, and that's a true testament to the vocal range of both Stephen Wilson and Aviv Geffen. They're both individually great singers, but together it's just magic. It really is. So there you have it. Blackfield 1, the debut of Blackfield, and just a tremendous album from Stephen Wilson and Aviv Geffen. Absolutely love it. Great album. So we move on to the next album, and this one came out in 2007, and this one is called Blackfield 2. So Blackfield 2 is a follow-up to Blackfield 1, and this is an excellent follow-up to the first album, and more or less retains the style and energy of the first album. So Blackfield by this point has kind of morphed into a stable lineup. So we've got Stephen Wilson on guitars and keyboards and vocals, and Aviv Geffen on guitars, keyboards, and vocals. So we've got Tomazi on drums, and we've got Sefi Afriti on bass, and Daniel Solomon on piano. So this is pretty much near enough the lineup for most of the Blackfield albums, although there would be some guest contributions from Stephen Wilson's Porcupine Tree bandmates. But aside from that, this is pretty much virtually the Blackfield lineup for most of these albums. And what started out as more of a duo collaborative project between Geffen and Wilson, by this album, it's now turned into a full-fledged band, and they're a great band. They really are. So most of the songs are written and co-composed by Stephen Wilson and Aviv Geffen, and there's some really good music on Blackfield 2. So we've got Once, which is an excellent opener. 1,000 People is great. Miss You is excellent. Christenings is another great song. This Killer is great. Epidemic is great. My Gift of Science is brilliant. Someday, which is a lovely song. Where Is My Love is great. And then we've got the closer, End of the World. Top to bottom, excellent songs, lots of catchy harmonies, great playing, and just lovely music, just very uplifting. The melodies really reel you in, and it's just catchy stuff. It really is. And as I said, a lot of the songs are quite short, 3 to 4 minutes, but they're still very enjoyable. And when I was listening to a lot of these albums, I was so into listening to it, it was over, and I thought, oh, I was hoping for a bit more, because that's how engaging Blackfield's music really is. And as I said, this is the sort of music you probably would have heard on the radio back in like the early 2000s, or even to this day. It's got a very pop style commercial sound of music, but it's very good music in my opinion. So the standouts for me are Once, Miss You, Christenings, Epidemic, My Gift of Science, Where Is My Love, and The End of the World. Great music. Stephen Wilson on top form as always. Aviv Geffen on top form as well. And the rest of the band are equally as good as Geffen and Wilson. They all bring their A game, and there's some really good playing. But as I said, it's not really necessarily about big, long, heavy, lengthy solos. this is just about good songs, and that's exactly what Blackfield do as good as anyone. They deliver great songs and some memorable stuff. So there you have it, Blackfield 2, an excellent follow up to Blackfield 1. Lovely album, really enjoyed this one a lot. So we move on to the next album, and this one came out in 2011, and this one is called Welcome to My DNA. Probably the most proggy album of the entire Blackfield catalogue, and certainly the most experimental. And Aviv Geffen takes on more of the writing side of Blackfield, but Stephen Wilson still co-writes a couple of numbers. But you can see by this point, Stephen Wilson and his solo career was really starting to blow up. So he kind of more or less takes a step back, but he's still heavily involved in the production of this album. And as you can see, Aviv Geffen has taken on the more lead side of the writing, but there's still excellent music. And as I said, this is probably the most proggiest album of the entire Blackfield catalogue. But I loved it. I thought this was a really good album. And I love the way the songs all blend into each other. So it just feels like one big song. But I loved it. To me, this kind of sounds like the Lost Porcupine Tree album because Porcupine Tree by this point were pretty much done. They pretty much went into a hiatus, and Stephen Wilson went out on his own with a tremendous solo career that's still going on to this day as we speak. But Stephen Wilson's presence is definitely felt throughout this album, and just a great sounding album. The production on this album, as are all of the Blackfield albums, is excellent. If you've got a good stereo system, put this in the player, sit back, and just let it blast out. There's some really good sounds on this album, and the sound quality is just impeccable. And that's what I've always loved about Stephen Wilson's albums. You're going to get the best sound quality, and he always delivers in the sounding department. So we've got here Glass House, which is great. Go to Hell, which is got some colourful language, but it's a really good song. Rising of the Tide is great. Waving, which is just absolutely beautiful. Far Away is great. Dissolving with the Night is excellent. Blood is great. On the Plane is another great song. Oxygen is great. And Zigota, which is great. And the final track is DNA. But top to bottom, excellent album. Kind of sounds like the Lost Porcupine Tree a little bit, but still very enjoyable. And the standouts for me are Glass House, Go to Hell, Waving, Far Away, Dissolving with the Night, Oxygen, and DNA. But really enjoyed this album a lot. As I said, it did sound a little bit heavy in some spots. I thought, sounds like Porcupine Tree a little bit. But then it goes the other way. You just think, there it is. There's Blackfield. But still very good. I really love this album a lot. And, probably could be my favourite of all 6 Blackfield albums. But none of the other albums are to be sniffed at. But I think Welcome to My DNA really stood out to me the most. I thought, I could really latch on to this one. It's a really good album. So there you have it. Blackfield, Welcome to My DNA. Probably the band's best album of their entire catalogue, in my opinion. Just really good and very strong. And there's a little bit of prog, there's a little bit of pop, a little bit of hard rock. It's all there, but it's still really good. So there you have it. Blackfield, Welcome to My DNA. Excellent album, and could very well be my favourite of the 6, in my opinion. Love it. So we move on to the next album, and this one came out in 2013, and this one is called Blackfield 4. So by this point, Stephen Wilson's role in Blackfield has more or less taken a back seat. So he's taken a step back to concentrate on his solo career. So Aviv Geffen for this album has taken on a more active leading role in Blackfield in terms of the compositions. But Steven Wilson is still part of this album, and he's featured on a couple of tracks. So it's pretty much the same lineup as are most of these albums. But this album is Aviv Geffen is more at the forefront, while Steven Wilson is more in the background. And I'm not knocking this album. It's still great, but you can definitely notice the difference in terms of the style. Now, although Blackfield has always been noted as a equal collaborative partnership between Steven Wilson and Aviv Geffen, and while for the most part that hasn't really changed, you'll notice on the first three Blackfield albums, Steven Wilson has a much larger and dominant presence, and it really shows throughout the music of those first three albums. But when you come to the fourth album, you can definitely feel the difference. And this album is still really good. You know, there's a lot of memorable tracks, but you can definitely feel that. Not saying that something's missing, but you can hear it a little bit differently. And I'm not saying that Aviv Geffen isn't a great songwriter. He's a really good songwriter in his own right. But I think it's lacking a little bit of that Steven Wilson magic that we all know and love because, you know, separately, these guys are great songwriters, although Steven Wilson's got the slight edge, but when they're together, Geffen and Wilson, it's magic. And as I said, I did enjoy this album, but I kind of felt like, it's kind of missing that Steven Wilson flavour a little bit, but still some really good songs. So apart from the absence of Steven Wilson, this is pretty much the same lineup, just without him. But he's on a couple of tracks, but those tracks to me really stood out. So we've got Pills, which is an excellent song. Sometimes is another great song. X-Ray is great. Sense of Insanity is one of my favourite songs on this album. I thought that was a really good track. Firefly is great. The Only Fool Is Me, which is brilliant. Jupiter, another favourite song of mine from this album. Kissed by the Devil is a great song. Lost Souls is great. Faking is great. And After the Rain, which is the closer, which is a really good track as well. So by and large, top to bottom, Blackfield 4 is a great album. It's not weak by any means. It's still very good, but you know, without Steven Wilson's presence, yeah, this kind of drops a little bit. But there's still some really good songs. There's some catchy tracks on here, and I still enjoyed it. But I'm not going to lie, I kind of miss Steven Wilson's presence just a little bit, you know, because those first three albums were really good. But this one, still good, but probably not one I would reach for that much. So, standout tracks for me are Pills, X-Ray, Sense of Insanity, Firefly, Jupiter, Lost Souls, and After the Rain. But a very good album, very enjoyable. Maybe not as strong as the first three, but that doesn't mean this album's bad because it's not. None of these albums are bad, but I just feel that maybe this was a little bit of a drop off compared to the first three albums, which were remarkably strong. But still, some good stuff. But I'm not going to lie, I do miss the Steven Wilson magic just a little bit. So there you have it. Blackfield 4, an enjoyable album, maybe not as strong as the first three, but still got some great material to get your teeth into. So there you have it. Blackfield 4. Good album, but not one that I would probably reach for that much, but still worth checking out. So there you have it. Blackfield 4. So we move on to the next album, and this one came out in 2016, and this one is called Blackfield 5. So Steven Wilson is back in the fold and has taken on a more active role in the collaborative side of things once again, and you can definitely see the difference between number 5 to number 4. You know, Steven Wilson, he has a big presence and it really shows in the music. And when you've got a guy like Steven Wilson on your team, you know the music is going to be excellent. And Geffen and Wilson together is just magic. And Wilson was definitely missed on Blackfield 4. Even though he was featured on a couple of tracks, his presence was dearly missed, but he's back in the fold for Blackfield 5, and it really shows. And this album has got some strong material, and it's kind of like a loose concept in a way, themes about oceans and stuff, but it's a really good, strong, solid album. And I really enjoyed this one a lot. And this really felt like to me a return to form for Blackfield, and it definitely is a big step up from Blackfield 4. Not taking anything away from Blackfield 4, still very good, but I think number 5 just really shot it to the stratosphere. It's just a really good, strong album. So, most of the songs are written and composed by Aviv Geffen, with the exception of 2 tracks by Stephen Wilson and Aviv Geffen. And there is also 1 track which is composed by Stephen Wilson, and the producing duties were handled by the legendary Alan Parsons. Now I know why I like this album just a bit more. You've got Stephen Wilson, you've got Alan Parsons, and then you've got Aviv Geffen. That's a winner in my book, and it really shows. And the production on this album is just excellent. So we've got A Drop in the Ocean, which is an instrumental, short and sweet, and more or less just helps set the tone for what this album is going to be like. And then we've got Family Man, which is excellent. How Was Your Ride is great. Will Never Be Apart, which is excellent. Sorries is great. Life is an Ocean is excellent. Lately is great. October is brilliant. The Jackal, one of my favourite songs from this album, absolutely brilliant. Salt Water is great. Undercover Heart is excellent. Lonely Soul is great. And the closer, which is another favourite of mine, from 44 to 48. Top to bottom, a remarkably strong album, lots of great material, very catchy harmonies from Wilson and Geffen, and my God, tremendous album in my opinion. One of the best albums from this catalogue, and a return to form for Blackfield. And the standout tracks for me are A Drop in the Ocean from 44 to 48, Sorries, Life is an Ocean, October, The Jackal, Saltwater, Family Man, and How Was Your Ride. But every song on here is a banger, absolutely fantastic, and one of my favourites from Blackfield's catalogue. Just a tremendous album and a real game changer as far as the sound of Blackfield is concerned. So there you have it. Blackfield 5, one of my favourite albums from Blackfield's catalogue. Excellent stuff. Really enjoyed this one a lot. So we move on to the next album, and this one came out in 2020, and this one is called For the Music. So For the Music is the 6th album from Blackfield, and it could probably be the most poppiest album of the entire Blackfield catalogue. It's got a very poppy and commercial style of music, but it still retains a lot of the classic hallmarks that we all know Blackfield for. And Stephen Wilson is featured on a couple of tracks, and the lineup is near enough the same lineup we've got for most of these albums, but still some enjoyable stuff. And again, still a good album, but much like Blackfield 4, this is probably one I wouldn't really reach for that much. But there's still some great songs on here. But I kind of like some of the more earlier Blackfield albums, where Stephen Wilson had a much more larger and active role. But still a great album, very enjoyable, got some memorable hooks, some great songs. But as I said, this is probably not as strong as Blackfield 4. Maybe it's the lack of Stephen Wilson, who knows? But I just feel that when Aviv Geffen and Stephen Wilson are together, that's where the magic is at. But Aviv Geffen, still a very talented musician, a great singer, and great guitar player too. But I feel that the driving force behind Blackfield is when it's the two of them, and you can't really have one without the other. And it does show here in the music. The music is still excellent. Production is great, but I feel that some of the earlier albums were maybe just a little bit better, but still good. Still very good. So we got the title track For the Music, which is great, which has got Stephen Wilson on one track. Really good track. After All is excellent. Garden of Sin is great. Under My Skin is good. Over and Over is great. Falling is great. White Nights is great. Summer's Gone is great. And It's So Hard, which is the closer. But a good strong effort, top to bottom. This is a very good album, but maybe not as strong as some of the other albums, but still very good. Still an enjoyable album and one definitely worth listening to, in my opinion. So the standout tracks for me are For the Music, Garden of Sin, Under My Skin, Falling, White Nights, Summer's Gone, and It's So Hard. But top to bottom, pretty good solid album. Not one I would reach for that often, but I still enjoyed it. It's a great sounding album. The production, as you'd expect, is tremendous, but maybe not one of my favourite Blackfield albums, but still enjoyable and definitely well worth listening to if you want to get into Blackfield's music. So there you have it. For the Music, good solid effort from Blackfield, but I feel that maybe there are a couple of other Blackfield albums, in my opinion anyway, that are a little bit better than others. So there you have it. Blackfield, For the Music. Good album. So, which Blackfield album out of all 6 studio recordings do I think is the best one? Well, they're all great. They all have their own personality. There are a couple that I feel are a little bit better than others. But I think, above all else, by and large, start to finish, this is a very strong catalogue. There is some excellent music, some very enjoyable stuff. But for me, the one that really stood out to me the most, and one that I will consider to be my all time favourite, is Welcome to My DNA. I think this is probably the best album out of the entire Blackfield catalogue. It's certainly the most proggiest of the 6 albums, and I really enjoyed this one a lot. I think Blackfield really peaked with the third album, and it's got some really good stuff, and it does sound a little bit like Porcupine Tree, but just maybe a little bit more on the lighter and commercial side in terms of experimentation. But it's a really good album, and this one really stood out to me. A little bit of colourful language on certain tracks, but it's a really good, strong album, and I really like this one a lot. I think this one really made the biggest impact on me, in my opinion. So there you have it. Blackfield, Welcome to My DNA, by far the best Blackfield album in their entire catalogue, and my all-time favourite. Absolutely love this one. A really good album, in my opinion. So that's going to be it from me. I'm going to wrap this up now. What's your favourite Blackfield album? Is it Blackfield 1, Blackfield 2, Welcome to My DNA, Blackfield 4, Blackfield 5, or For the Music? There's no right or wrong answer. We all have our favourite albums. You know what to do, guys. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, leave your thoughts and comments down below, and I will see all of you next time for another edition of the Progressive Rock and Metal album review series. So until next time, take care, everybody, and stay safe. And once again, as always, much appreciated. Thanks for listening.